Thanks. It's good to be here. I also work at the University of Roehampton, and so I'm presenting research that I've done with Claire, who is here, around learning in marginal spaces. So yeah, I feel like this crosses over my two different commitments. My starting point of thinking about this this question, which I call flourishing after the Makin report. I guess you could include the scolding review in there as well, and I will draw a bit on that. And the talk from this morning has helpfully given some context, and it's also been interesting to hear some of the conversations that have gone on beyond that discussion this morning, which I'll try and kind of pick up a little bit through this. So I don't really need to introduce those reports to the scolding review as into Mike for the Butler and Still Survivor, and the Makin report into John Smythe and the Owen counts. And what I want to do is to have a to say, which not realizing that that would be what we presented on as well at the conference, was to say what is the conversation that we might need to have around these questions of abuse and being safe in the church, and realizing that the research that we've done might have some helpful things to say. And so what I want to do is to pick up some of the questions that come out of the Makin report and the scolding review that I think helpful questions for us to reflect further on, and then ask about the sites that a few of the sites that we've looked at in our research, as to what they might have to kind of open up that conversation further. In the Makin report, which looks at the abuse and cover-up of the abuse by John Smythe, some of the things that it highlights are a distinct lack of curiosity shown by senior figures, the problem of things being an open secret, and desires to protect the reputation of groups. The scolding review into Mike Pilarchi similarly pointed to these problems of culture, the ways in which things were written off as Mike being Mike, the fact that people kind of knew about these things at a low level. And a particularly quote from the scolding review that I think is kind of helpful as you think about this context is the way in which it says Mr. Pilarchi articulated it to us as seeking to create a culture where authentic relationships between people could be fostered and where people would care for one another, serve one another, and be vulnerable with one another. And the ways in which in the report says this becomes blurred, that authentic relationships, as was said this morning, became to have a relationship with Mike Pilarchi. But I'm just interested in the fact that this language of authentic relationship and vulnerability are key language that we've heard through so many of the sites that we've done the research. So I'm just highlighting that as something that to kind of focus that into. So as I say, what I want to look at here is how some of these kind of things raised by these reports might be worth exploring further and asking deeper questions about. And there's a lot said in these reports about policy and procedure, about safeguarding. And at no point do I want to say that that isn't crucial. But what I want to say is that if that's where we focus all our energy, then there may be things that are missed. And so by focusing on this question of culture, and by looking at culture, I think I want to also say theology. I'm not in any way saying that safeguarding, policy and procedure are to be undermined. And in fact, in the sites we looked at, there was a lot of energy and effort put to that, as I will highlight. So helpful to tell you a little bit about our project. We called it the Edgy Learning Project, and how people learn and grow in faith in what might be experienced as edgy or might be experienced as marginal spaces. So you can see a list there of different groups that we work with, but from a kind of from quite classic pioneer context through to other senses of edginess around organisations working with prison leaders, African diaspora networks, So, edginess in various different ways, edginess to the church, edginess socioeconomically, edginess around different abilities, ethnicities. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that we used a methodology called theological action research, which means that we work with the sites that we're with to design the research together and to explore questions together. So it's a collaborative methodology. So it's not researchers going in, collecting data and disappearing again to think about it, but actually working with the sites from planning to collecting data to reflecting on it together to identifying their. And can I point you towards this 4 voices diagram at the top right here, which is a kind of fundamental understanding of how theology is at play in the research. And during, this diagram. And particularly want to point to this idea of espoused and operant theology. So when we're saying there's different theological voices to hear from, there's normative voices of the church would point to as its kind of authorities, but maybe around scripture and liturgy and creeds, and formal theology of theologians, which we would all recognize, I think, and would probably be what we think of when we talk about theology. But also to realize that in what people say and in what people do, there is theological insight which needs to be taken seriously. And what I want to do is pick up 3 themes from the research that we did and just explore some of these ideas around safeguarding and being safe in light of those questions about theology and culture. So one of the groups we worked with was a city centre chaplaincy team. And they had part of their work was around a coffee kind of drop-in in a local coffee shop where they booked a table, people came and they sat around and drank coffee together regularly on Friday morning. And Shirley, who had begun attending that drop-in and had since connected to other things around the chaplaincy and local churches, had this to say about it. Extended my social world, if you like. And that's a good thing about having these groups is, I tell you sometimes the group, it's a bit like a counselling service. For people who just want to get things off their chest, you know what I mean? To be in a safe place and talk. And if you don't mind everybody else hearing it, so there's no safeguarding and all that, you don't mind people sharing. And I guess that, what's she getting at when she says there's no safeguarding and all that? Because I know that there's safeguarding. We've talked to the leaders, they're very clear on that. In fact, I would say they've thought very carefully about what it means to have this space as a safe space. And yet, somehow it's experienced as a place with no safeguarding, I think in itself says something about the way in which sometimes safeguarding can be experienced. And I think what she's getting at here, and she goes into this further, is something about the sense of authentic relationship, which we saw in that earlier report, experiencing those relationships in a safe space. So, this connection to things like counselling, she goes on to talk about it's a place where you can go if you're lonely and you need company. And that different people can sit around and get on and talk together. And so there's something revealing here, I think, about the way safeguarding the formal structures of safeguarding can be seen by people as a way that actually breaks down trust rather than builds trust. So what does it mean to have safeguarding and to have this sense of authentic relationship? I think is a crucial question. There's lots to say about how I think this group have done that, but that's not quite the point I want to make. But what I want to ask is something about our question of the conference, flourishing. What is it that made this space flourishing? It was safe, and there's a significance of flourishing about authentic relationship. So you could obviously have safe spaces which are, completely sterile environments, but that actually, they're technically safe. But there was something about the way in which relationships operated which made her experience it as safe. Which again is not to blur the sense of experiencing safe and actually being safe. So this question of how is safeguarding experience being a crucial one. The second side that I want to look at was this group working with prison leaders. We explored a lot of elements of their work, but one of their questions was how do they support and accompany prison leaders and to see them where they want to grow in faith, but also to grow into being able to kind of re-engage with society. And what they described this was as how to disciple vulnerable people. So we hear this language of vulnerability coming up here. But the way that this language of vulnerability was used is I think worth flagging. And they worked with churches, this organisation, and there was a focus group that we had that was with church leaders. And it was interesting to hear them talk about these vulnerable prison leaders who were coming to their churches. And clearly, they needed very careful safeguarding structures to deal with that. But there was something about those structures which had made that, although these prison leaders were regularly part of their congregation, they seemed to talk about them as if they weren't. And they talked about being in this kind of tension of needing to know when to care for the prison leader and when to care for their congregation, as if those were something slightly separate. And again, I totally get it. But I guess the question I want to ask is there a kind of theological question undergoing here? And so the first place we began to turn as we reflected on this was about this sense of vulnerability. If vulnerability is about the people who are vulnerable are the ones we need to safeguard, was that causing some of the problem? And actually to say, well, there are ways as humans that we are all vulnerable. What might it mean to explore that sense of all being vulnerable and to recognize different levels of vulnerability and different times that we are vulnerable? But I'm not sure that goes far enough. And we saw the way that the vulnerability was highlighted, this kind of abuse of the language of vulnerability was seen in the Scolding Review, and similarly in the Jean Vanier, this problem of the way in which vulnerability was used in very problematic ways. But as we returned to talk to the staff, what was very interesting was this conversation that developed actually about the prioritizing of agency. And that these were communities that they were building, the kind of houses that they housed prison leaders in. They saw as communities which were giving people agency, encouraging them to volunteer, to recognize, and that they saw the importance of actually giving people responsibility and agency. And sometimes that went wrong, and sometimes they went back to prison, and they came out, and they didn't have this kind of perfect story, but through that, and through recognizing both vulnerability and agency, that there was something important. So again, one of the things that I kind of want to highlight in terms of thinking about flourishing is flourishing which recognizes that we are all vulnerable, but a flourishing which recognizes that we all have gifts and we all need to have agency in these is going to be crucial. The third site that I want to talk about is an online church for an online group for those with mental and physical disability. And actually, they didn't call themselves church, although by the end of the time with it, they began to wonder whether they could call themselves church. But they were a group of Christians who met, although not exclusively Christians, and had drawn people from a kind of all across, all sorts of people into this group where they shared things together. And I think what stood out in terms of the conversation today was the way in which they reflected on their experience in this group compared to their experience, some of their experiences in church. And this first bit, it's easy to pick up the idea that you are less in church circles. This is because of several things. The way it is structured, like you have to be full of energy. You have to be quite physically fit. You have to be able to participate and join in to not end up on the fringe. And then, for Bridget, so these are both people who are involved in the kind of leadership team of that group. And there's a fear, I think, in a lot of churches that we've got to make sure everything's okay. Everyone's got to be happy. It's a good news story, where actually it's a real life story. And what does it mean to tell real life stories? And another of the leadership team reflected on being part of a church service where someone had reflected on the Psalms of Lament and some difficult stories. And he said, everyone was too sad. It was like it was like they had to, this was their kind of moment. And it's like, for us in our group, we hold these things together, the joy and the lament. Every week there's joy, every week there's lament. And in church, it was just felt like this was the week that we lamented. And it was really, and he said, I want the real life, again, turning to this idea of real life story. And actually what they began to reveal was a way in which the language of human flourishing, and if you like, the operant theology, the theology embedded in the way that this was lived, was actually problematic about the way it envisioned human flourishing. And how, so that the question that raises really is about what is the theology of human flourishing that's embedded in what we do? And this sense that everybody says we're safe, we're welcoming, we're inclusive. That's our espoused theology. But actually, are we willing to ask some questions about our operant theology, the theology in the way that we live, that asks some helpful questions? So, questions that this asks is, how can we have safe structures where authentic relationships are valued, where there is shared vulnerability, but also shared agency, and where our espoused accounts of welcome and inclusion aren't undermined by the operant experience? Can we hold different paces of life, different experiences of life, different times of life together in a space where those things can be held together? And so, if thinking about, Jesus said, I came to they may have life and have it abundantly. What's the vision that's held? What is the vision of that life in abundance that's held up as the norm? Are people able to operate in ways which enable theirs and the community's flourishing? Everybody's flourishing. And what are the ends to which our church planting is directed? So I just want to pick up those last couple of bits in reflecting a bit further. Just say that all the pictures here are actually from an artist who came to one of our final days of drawing all the participants together and reflecting on the themes, where he's kind of done the artwork, pulling out some of the themes that came from the reflections. So I wanted to ask, what is a theology of human flourishing, pioneering, and church planting? And I think kind of where I began to land, and the things that I kind of want to unpick further, and there's much more theological conversation to be had here, but that recognition of maybe human flourishing needs to be underpinned by a sense of human dignity. Catholic social teaching, sense of human dignity, and love of neighbour, but also love of God. And I think I love that Catholic social teaching, that its kind of foundation is in this sense of the love of God. That's where all of these things come from. That safety and agency, and being able to operate at different speeds. But the last thing I want to just point to is actually the way that the group, the online group for those with disability, Bridget reflected on 1 Corinthians 12. So, I haven't got it out there. Before I became disabled, I always read it as a body, but ignored the metaphor. It was just a metaphor. It wasn't the language itself. Whereas now, it literally talks about losing an eye. Well, been there, done that, and I suddenly understand more about how that speaks to my situation, but also how it speaks into people within a church or every Christian community together across the world. What does it mean not to look at 1 Corinthians 12 as an organizational structure of the church, but actually a living body with its frailties, its aging, its difficulty? But also, as we talked about this, we were pushed to think about, Paul says at the end of 1 Corinthians 12, and I will show you a more excellent way. And where does he go? He goes to talk about love. And he put into that eschatological vision. And I think when we think about these things, we need to think about our theology of human flourishing that's at play, but also we need to ask the question of what are the ends of what we're doing? Are our ends aligned with these ends that Paul points us to, the more excellent way, those ends of faith, hope, and love? I think it's very easy to get pulled into thinking about different ends for our organisation, different ends in terms of how they grow. But if we really thought that faith, hope, and love, that the love of people, that the love of God, that faith, and offering that hope I wonder whether we might begin to kind of be able to open up a really helpful conversation to have about these things. So I really think that we do need to find that more excellent way in our desire to be saved.